Hello and welcome to another episode of Tory Talks. I'm Sam. This is...
Hello, I'm Ian.
And today's subject is the House of Lords. And that is
Da, da,
because...
da.
and that is because we've just had the recent announcement of names of people who are going to be entering and adding to the already existing Lords. So... do you want to kick us off, Ian, with your opinion of the House of Lords?
Yeah, it's a strange one, really. I think my current opinion now is that it needs massive reform. And I'm afraid to say that for the sake of democracy, we must have an elected second chamber. It has to be elected. Now, I mean, one of the things that would do is get rid of this furore there always is every time that there's announcements made on new appointments, because it doesn't matter who's in power. Obviously, they usually appoint more people from their own side than they do the other side. But they always come with lots of negativity. So people get appointed to the Lords, and people always come back and attack those appointments, mainly on political matters. And I think that kind of demeans the very meaning of the House of Lords. And so certainly my initial thought, although I could go into it a lot deeper, my initial thought is we must move to an elected second chamber, an all elected second chamber. And I never thought I'd say that because, you know, many years ago when the things like the hereditary peers were kicked out under Labour and everything like that, I was obviously dead against that, being a conservative, liking to conserve things. But the more you look at it and the more you realise, the more you understand that the only fair way really is to have an elected chamber. When you consider that they can veto rules made by the elected House of Commons, it seems wrong that in the 21st century we've handed vetoing type power to a group of people that aren't elected. Seems quite old-fashioned to me, and I'm an old-fashioned guy.
Yes, you are. Right, bear with me.
Sam, this is Sam putting on her pretend mum voice. I don't actually think she's got any children. He does this every week so to make her look as though she's got children, you know. Like, they don't really exist. Don't tell her I said that, bud.
What are you saying?
Nothing.
Did you hear that?
Nothing, but I dare you not to edit it. So yeah, I mean, I think we need to get to an elected second chamber. How about yourself?
I was of the opinion of getting rid of it full stop. So not reform it, have it as... well, I'm in two minds. So my initial thought was just get rid of it. We don't need it. We should just have the directly elected representatives and they make all the law decision powers. We already use experts, people in the field to give advice on certain things. We've seen that with the pandemic. We already get people who are in certain industries or scientists or experts to advise on law anyway, but the ultimate decision making should be elected representatives. So I didn't see the point of having a second house as such. But then
Okay.
I did think today that it might be a nice idea if we were to have a second house that was more representative of the demographics of the people, because a massive criticism towards the House of Commons is that a lot of people look, sound the same, have been to the same school, of a similar background, and they're the ones that get into the House of Commons. And I thought it might be a nice idea to have a kind of a House of Representatives as such, where it's broken down into the demographics that we have. So you have representatives of all different kinds of people, but in the proportion to how we are as a society, like how we are in the UK. So if there's it would be 52% women. It would be, but then it might be overcomplicated. But I thought it would be nice to have our lawmakers or part of the decision-making process, which was representative of how the country actually looks. But there was just an idea. I personally just think we should get rid of it. A massive criticism I have of it is, and this was seen in Brexit and the Brexit negotiations and everything else, is we've got a 2-tier. The second tier is unelected people that are appointed who can block laws going through. And we saw that with the Brexit situation, that these people blocked Brexit. And the whole reason, a massive reason why we voted to leave the EU is because we didn't want unelected representatives making decisions that are going to impact on our day-to-day life, where we have just that in the UK, with or without the EU.
Okay, well, look, I see where you're coming from, but it was a perfect storm. The Brexit debate was a perfect storm because let's not forget, it's very, very rare that a government in power will try and enact controversial legislation like Brexit when they don't have a majority. Okay, and the only reason it appeared as though the Lords were blocking it was because we didn't have a majority. Because the House of Commons does have the golden ticket as far as legislation goes. It can enact powers to overrule the House of Lords, but obviously that would have to be voted on by a majority in the Commons. And we can all remember last year where nothing was voted on in a majority at the Commons. So what was happening was it seemed as though the House of Lords was hampering the Brexit effort, but it was actually the House of Commons that was doing that because the House of Commons was tied up. So yes, the House of Lords can amend a law. They can almost stop it, as you say. But in much the same, the Commons can overrule that decision. So I think it's interesting that you say to not have a second chamber. I'm probably incorrect here, but certainly every country I can think of has a second chamber, done in different ways. I think it is important to have a second chamber. It is important. Often amendments that come back from the House of Lords are often accepted by the government of the day. And that's why you don't hear much in the press about it, because often they look into the more finer technical detail and they have more time to go through that than they do in the Lords. So I think if you were to consider not having a second chamber, you'd have to make so many changes to the way the Commons works that you'd almost be changing the whole system. I think to have a second chamber does offer checks and balances that a single chamber doesn't. But again, one of the reasons I say an elected chamber is because most people aren't aware, but obviously the House of Lords doesn't reflect the political balance of the Commons. So obviously, what throws that into jeopardy a lot is the fact that there are so many what we call crossbenchers in the House of Lords, which are good in all intents and purposes. They're basically people that don't come under the not control, but they're not member of any one of the political parties. So they're people that are there for a contribution they've made to society as a whole. So somebody like Alan Sugar, for example, was a crossbench peer. That doesn't mean he's not going to side with Labour on some things or side with the Conservative on some things, but he was a crossbencher. Now, there could be mileage in saying that everybody in the House has to be unaffiliated politically. So you're not allowed to be a member of a political party, or political parties don't exist per se in the House of Lords, because realistically in the House of Lords, it's got a similar setup where you have although the Conservatives don't hold a majority in the House of Lords, because the government is conservative, they still lead on the legislation. So there'll be a leader of the House of Lords, there'll be a shadow leader of the House of Lords from Labour. So it is very set up along, and there'll be Liberal Democrats as well. So it's very, very much set up along those political fault lines. And I think if you're going to set it up like that, then it has to be elected. Because what we've got at the moment is, I believe there's 250, 260 Conservative peers, something like that. I think there's about 175, 180 Labour peers. I think there's 40 or 50 Liberals. But I think there's approaching 300 cross benches.
Yes,
okay?
There's 800 working peers overall. Approximately 800. So I think it's capped now.
Yeah, but now, to put that into context, that means there's 650 in the Commons and 850 in the Lords.
So there's more.
There is no way the second.
Yeah,
there is no way the second chamber should be bigger than the first. See, now America do it very, very differently. They have a presidential style, but look at the numbers in America, a country that's got a population 5 or 6 times bigger than the UK. So each state, regardless of size, has 2 senators in the House, in the upper house. So that's only 100, was it 51 or 52 states? So that's only just over 100 senators there are in their main lawmaking house, as it were. The House of Representatives, which is actually the lower house, they do theirs around the other way, has got far more people in it, but I think has still only got a few hundred. Ours is massive. Now, I know there was plans to reduce the size of the Commons a few years ago, got shelved. I think they're going to be brought back soon, bringing it back to 600. But that's still 600, still massive. Then to have a further 800 on the so-called gravy train, we all hear these horror stories where, lots of people in the Lords, they go and they sign in, they get there, because you don't get paid for the Lords, but you go and sign in for your £300 expenses for the day. Then they just disappear.
Well, there was.
But the fact they're not.
Someone did actually claim that he told the taxi just to stay there, and he went in, signed his form, and then went and got 305 quid for it.
Pretty commonplace. But that does highlight another problem with the Lords, is that it's not inclusive enough. It's a bit like working in local government. I can afford to work in local government, being this age, because I earn a decent salary. If I didn't, I wouldn't be able to. It's not the House of Lords, obviously, because it does now. £300 a day is brilliant, but if you don't earn anything, you've still got to get yourself there. You've got to stay in London. It's not inclusive to everybody. So if you're going to have it there, I just feel that it should be. I like your idea, representative of the population, but even then, I'm no lover at all. So I'd fight it tooth and nail to have quotas on anything. When you mentioned 52% women, that means you'd also have to have a quota for nationalities amongst the UK.
And then it would be sexuality and disability. So it's probably not practical, because how far do you go? But it would just be nice to have something that would be representative of the country instead of what we've got at the moment. If you are going to reform and probably still keep the whole unelected side of it, which is not something I'd want to do, then I would like to, at the very least, see it representative of the actual country. But it would be far too complicated. It would just be lovely if that could actually happen.
but you see, by nature, the more inclusive you make something, the more like real life it gets. Because more people can put themselves forward. Some people would be put off putting themselves forward to be an MP because, like you said earlier, lots of them come from the same schools, the same backgrounds, and you might think it's a bit of a closed shop, certainly in the Conservatives anyway. And we'd have to make sure that the Lords wasn't like that. And if it wasn't like that, then I think more people from a diverse background may come into it, because, you don't tend to put yourself forward for something if you know you're going to get rejected. And that's the issue. If they make it more open, then more people are going to put themselves forward. And generally, over time, that then equals itself out. And I think that's shown in the House of Commons. It's far more easier. There are far more female representation in the Commons now than what there ever has been. I think the last government passed some quite good amendments to working practices in the Commons. We've seen people bring their young children babies into the Commons. We've seen people breastfeeding in the Commons. We've seen more flexibility with hours. There needs to be something done around the stupid times they hold their votes. Why they have to not start till lunchtime and not go till 11 o'clock at night is crazy. But that takes time. I would rather see changes made that make it more inclusive, and then it becomes more inclusive over a generation or two, rather than somebody coming in and saying, right, we want 52% of women, we want 5% to be from this cultural background because that's what's representative of the country, we want 3% to be Scottish, 1.5% to be from Northern Ireland, that kind of thing. That gets messy. And I always find with quotas, you do risk then having some people put in, elected, however they're going to be chosen, who aren't deserving, and there might be a more deserving cause who doesn't get in because they were the 49th man and they were only 48 allowed. But the 49th man, and this is probably the wrong, being a man, this is probably the worst one to use as an example. being the 49th man might make you better than, you might be better than any of the X or any of the Y, but you don't get it because of a quota. So quotas are awful, but it does go some way to wanting to represent what I want the Lords to actually be.
Yeah.
And for a start, let's not call it the House of Lords anymore, because it gives the wrong impression in the first place. It hasn't been that, it's not really the House of Lords. They're not Lords, are they? People give them the name Lords so they can be in the House of Lords. It's pathetic. It would get rid of the patronage that people see is happening. That, so like this last cohort that will come in. Now, there's people saying, oh, look, you've got this because you gave hundreds of thousands to the Conservatives. You got this because you did this. You got this because you did this. Now, that may be true. It may be because that person's absolutely brilliant at business or whatever and has got skills that we don't know about. But those questions shouldn't even be asked, because it should be more down to the public who, in this day and age, 2020, I was trying to really think of the date there, we are leaving it to an honours system to decide who is going to be part of our lawmaking process. And I just don't think that can be right.
I agree. And another thing is, people generally don't understand what it does. Like, what is the House of Lords? If you were to say I struggled even finding out how many Lords there actually are. I asked a friend, they said thousands. I was like, okay, so let's narrow it down to, out of these thousands of people that are Lords, who can actually do what? And then it was, and you get into the nitty gritties and you're like, this is actually quite complicated. You've got life peers, you've got hereditary peers, which have been limited since, and it's just, it all seems very bonkers. And for someone like you and I, and we were discussing this before we were filming,
you've got the clergy there as well.
The clergy as well. If we don't fully understand it and we're both politically engaged, how the hell is someone on the street going to understand it?
Well, I think part of that comes because it's almost an irrelevance now. And I think people see it as an irrelevance, but that's because of the way it's made up. And that's the shame about it. It is obviously a really important part of the legislature, but it isn't seen as that, probably because people don't know enough about it because they're turned off by it. I don't think you'll find that many people there that will want to see it retained in its current format. I think you'll have plenty of Conservatives that would like to see it go back to the old format, with it actually being the House of Lords and you being a hereditary peer to be in there, and it gets passed down the male line of succession and everything like that. I see you're probably screwing your face there, but that's exactly what it was. And I think that there'll probably be people that would want to see a return to that, but that's not going to happen. I just think that the time for change is now, and we have an opportunity to make something really good. and to make our parliament, when you consider that, our parliament, they do call it the mother of all parliaments. Lots of other countries took their lead from what we had. Let's move with the times a little bit. Let's make our parliament more modern. Let's make our legislature more inclusive. And let's see where that takes us. And let's be a world leader again, rather than just sitting back and resting on our laurels.
Yeah. But do you think it's actually going to happen? Because the House of Lords was created in about 1295, I think, and it has been criticised ever since. So, the House of Commons in 1649 deemed it as useless and dangerous. You had in the 18th century there were problems with the House of Lords as well, and it wasn't fit for purpose. And the criticisms that we're making now were criticisms that were back then. And we've limited Tony Blair made some reforms. Boris Johnson is talking about some reforms as well. But are we ever going to realistically reform this to the point where it's fit for purpose? Do you believe?
Well, yes, because I'm ever the optimist. But the issue as I see it is because of how I mentioned earlier, because it doesn't tend to have a smoking gun, as it were. That Parliament the House of Commons always retains control because they can overrule. That's why the issue doesn't come up overly often. Tony Blair wanted to reform it from a purely political standpoint. Obviously, totally against hereditary peers, totally against the male line of succession, that kind of thing. You could understand that. If Boris Johnson chooses to change it, he's doing it because of his experience with the House of Lords and Brexit. But he's blaming the wrong thing. Like I said earlier, the problems with Brexit were caused by a hung parliament, not by the Lords. Because you have to remember that there is still the same majority in the House of Lords as what there was last year. So if they could really block things, they would be blocking it now because probably full of Remainers. But a government with a healthy majority, like we've got now, doesn't come into many problems with the Lords because they can always use their get out of jail free card. So that's why there's probably not so much, not been an appetite for change as much as what there should have been, because for most governments, it doesn't cause many issues. But most of these people that are in the Lords are very powerful, very influential people that would probably be against the change. And so you've got to be, I suppose, same problem as why we didn't deal with pensions for years, why we haven't dealing with social care. They're problems that don't have an easy answer. They're problems which don't have a popular answer. So if you were the government in power, why do something that you know is going to cause you a lot of problems, a lot of trouble, going to divide opinion, and you might not come out of it any better placed than what you are now. So I don't think the political will ever be there to change it because of the potential issues you may have once it's changed.
Yeah, because you have to change it into something else. And that's
yeah, you have to change it into something. Yeah, you do. But also, like I say, to you and me, it's an issue because it's not elected. Okay. But to Parliament, it's not necessarily an issue unless it stops them doing what they want to do. Yeah. Much the same way as Boris has got half a BDI on the Supreme Court at the moment. He hasn't got half a BDI on the Supreme Court because he's got some political ambition to get rid of the Supreme Court with something else. He's got a BDI on the Supreme Court because it messed him around last year. It's a personal thing. So had that have not happened, the spider brooch lady, had that have not happened, that wouldn't even be on his agenda. And that's the issue with these things. They're often not on the agenda because they don't often do something to upset the government of the day, as it were, because they can usually change it. But why shouldn't, argue against an elected second chamber? Find me somebody to argue against an elected second chamber. And it'll be interesting when this podcast goes out. And I think that when we put it out, and you leave this bit on there as well, it'll be interesting that when we're trying to advertise it, when we're trying to put it on social media, we put, is there anybody that wants to argue with us about an elected second chamber? Because it's very difficult to argue against. What could possibly anybody have against having an elected second chamber? I personally would have an elected second chamber, and I would have 2, 3, 4 people from each county.
Maybe as independents as well, so it's not political. So unlike the Commons, you have independents that stand. Instead of, that's another thing that you could go down, is have it from the county, but have independents standing. So it's not a political thing at all. It's just a group of elected independents. I think that would be quite interesting. But yeah, I was thinking of doing a poll anyway. But Labour are for reform, if not abolishing it. Even, Farage has been banging on about it anyway. I believe the Liberal Democrats are also in favour of reform, if not abolishing. And there is talk about reform through the Conservatives. So it feels like all the major parties, plus Mr. Farage pressure group guy, to get this changed. So I think if
agreed. I mean,
the time.
Agreed, but I think this is one of the problems as well, is that if you'd have asked what the political party's stance was on the House of Lords over the last 20 years, they'd have always all said, let's reform it. But if they really had that stance, they'd have reformed it. Because if every political party was really in favour of something, why hasn't it happened? I think that's the danger with something like this, that the status quo remains because it's easier for that to remain than to bring in something which nobody knows. You know what most politicians are like. Most politicians will do anything to protect themselves, or they'll sacrifice whoever to protect themselves. They'll only vote on things, they're very self-serving. So a politician is going to think, it's not great at the moment, but it's also not bad. It's not awful to us. So why change something that's not broken? Because to them, don't forget, to the majority of us in the wider population, the people in the House of Commons are just as out of touch to us as maybe the people in the House of Lords are.
Well, which is one of the... politics is comfortable for certain people in certain backgrounds. It's a comfortable thing. It's still an old boys club, and so any form of reform could rock the boat. And let's be honest, the way our system works at the moment, with first past the post and everything, it benefits the two main parties. Liberal Democrats came close with a coalition, but we're not going to see that again anytime soon. And we've now got a stonking majority. So if it isn't comfortable politics right now for the two major parties who just seem to swap and change, then nothing is. And so, the idea of reforming to think, okay, we're not sure how this would work. Could this rock everything and completely change politics forever? The two major parties probably aren't going to want that, as much as they say they want it.
Yeah. Well, it's like I say, I'm not too sure whether the appetite will ever be there in the same way as that if you ask individually each politician, do they want to see some action on social care? Every politician that's been a politician since 1990, let's say, will say, yes, we should do something like social care. Then if you ask them a question a year after they retired from being an MP, why didn't you do anything about social care? They won't have an answer. They'll all happy to say, yeah, we're for this, we're supporting this, because it almost seems to be fashionable. But if they really were supporting it, they'd do something.
Yeah. But I think post-Brexit, the heat is on now because everyone cares a little bit more about democracy. And so I think now, if it doesn't happen now, it's not going to happen in our lifetime.
Well, there's only one way to find out. And let's see. I actually think that could be the next populist battle, as it were. So Brexit has been the populist battle for some years now. Realistically, Brexit has been the populist battle since the early 90s. Since we've dropped out of the ERM, the Eurosceptics have been around, and that has been the populist us against them kind of battle. And I believe that once we leave, that focus will shift, and that very well may shift onto the House of Lords. Because I know, for example, Nigel Farage has got it in his sights, and we all know what he's like at galvanising support from from groups of the population. He's good at it, and he's good at single issue things as
Well,
well.
this is why I class him as a pressure group type of politician, because he's a single issue politician. He's mentioned I'm coming for the House of Lords next, and he's very good at putting pressure on it. But it's, in a way, it's quite easy to just focus on. Well, not in a way, it is just very easy to focus on a single issue and then try and push it as far as you can go. That's what he's done with Brexit, and I think he said he's got the Reform Party. I think is the new party that he's going to create, and that will be, again, on a single issue, reform the House of Lords.
Well, it's quite illuminating, really, because lots of people were suggesting that he should have been on the list of people to be nominated to the Lords last time.
He said on Question Time he would never go in there, though.
No, like I say, lots of people say that, but I think that would have been. I personally think that it would have been a good thing to actually offer him a place, because here's somebody that probably deserves it. It's somebody that, and again, you don't have to agree with somebody's politics, but here's somebody who's done as much for the political landscape in Britain, whether you agree or disagree, that most people have. But he's probably not being nominated for the wrong reasons. He's not being not nominated because people don't like his stance on Brexit or whatever. He's not being nominated because people think he's going to be an unruly influence in there and possibly lead a campaign to stop it. I'll take the Conservatives over Nigel Farage on any subject any day of the week. But it does go to show, well, I think it highlights both our arguments. If somebody like him isn't nominated to be in the House of Lords, then we've got the wrong choice system going into there. Okay. In the same way that were Diane Abbott or David Lammy to stop being an MP, somebody from complete the other side of politics to what I am, somebody that two people that really do divide public opinion, they are the type of people that should be nominated into the House of Lords, because they have given, and they have got years and years, decades and decades of political experience, and they represent areas that probably don't have that much representation in the House of Lords. So, and you know, they're two people that I probably couldn't disagree with more politically than anything. But that is just it. If you're gonna be inclusive, you've got to be inclusive of everybody.
Oh, I 100% agree. Diane Abbott, when she does retire, should absolutely be given that opportunity and put in there. But I'm hoping by that stage, House of Lords would have changed. So
am I.
We're in agreement today.
Yeah, so am I. Sorry?
We're in agreement today. That feels a little bit uncomfortable.
We are. It doesn't happen often. And I'm sure we'll put that. I'm sure we'll put that straight on the next episode.
Yeah. So it's been a pleasure. You've been easier to work with today.
I've tried my best. Sorry, because I've calmed down a little bit because I've just done a council online meeting before this, so I've got rid of a lot of my frustration on some council officers.
Brilliant. Well done. Well,
I think I was Mr. I think I was my Mr. I was my usual Mr. Unpopular.
Ah, nice. Well, we shall record after you have a meeting in future then, and then you're nicer to me.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.